Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well today. In this video, we're going to continue our crash course in logic by talking about common deductive argument forms. So in the video, we're just going to briefly review what validity is, then we'll introduce the idea of an argument form, and then I'll introduce some common valid forms for you to look out for. We'll look at modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, and hypothetical syllogism. Then I'll also introduce a couple common invalid forms for you to look out for as well. We'll look at affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. So one of the central concepts of deductive standards is the notion of validity. This is when it's impossible for all the premises of an argument to be true while the conclusion is false at the same time. Another way of saying the same thing is a valid argument is one where if all its premises were true, then its conclusion must also be true as well. That's the kind of connection between the premises and conclusion we're looking for. Now, philosophers often talk about how validity is a matter of the form or structure of the argument. It doesn't have anything to do with the subject matter or topic of the argument. To get clearer on this idea of argument form, let's compare two arguments. One from last video that says if Jane's passport is expired, then she's not allowed to travel out of the country. Jane's passport is expired, therefore Jane's not allowed to travel out of the country. Compare this to a second argument. If it's raining outside, then the streets are wet. It is raining outside, therefore the streets are wet. If you look at the arguments, if you compare them, they look very similar in a way, even though they have different topics. The way that they are similar is in virtue of their form. So let's see how we can sort of abstract the form of an argument using the mathematical idea of a variable. So let's look at this argument again. Notice in this first premise, it has two statements. Jane's passport is expired, and she's not allowed to travel out of the country. But these two statements are combined into a larger statement using the if and the then. This kind of statement is oftentimes called a conditional statement. It says on the condition that Jane's passport is expired, she won't be allowed to travel out of the country. The if part of a conditional is called the antecedent. The then part is called the consequent. So now notice the second premise takes the antecedent and says that it is true. And then the conclusion says that the consequent is thereby true. We can take the if part, the claim that Jane's passport is expired, and replace each instance of it with a variable. In this case, we'll use the same variable, A. We can then take the consequent, this other statement that she's not allowed to travel out of the country, and every time we see it, replace it with a different variable, B. And now we have the form of the argument. It says if A then B in the first premise. The second premise says that A is true. And then the conclusion says B is true. Compare those two arguments again. Notice they both start out by saying if one thing is true, then another thing is true. And then in the second premise, it says the first thing is true, the if part is true, and then it says the consequent is true in the conclusion. Replacing all the red parts with A, we get this. Replacing all the sort of purple parts in each argument with B, we get this. And so these arguments have the same form or structure or logic. That's what's similar between the arguments. And this form is what makes them valid. So every argument with this form is going to be valid. It doesn't matter what you put in for A, and it doesn't matter what you put in for B. You will always get a valid argument. And so if you can recognize when an argument has this form, you will automatically know that it's valid. So the argument we just discussed is a common valid argument form known as modus ponens. It says if A then B, A therefore B. We have our example, if it's raining then the streets are wet. It's raining, therefore the streets are wet. The A part is it's raining. The B part is the streets are wet. Another common valid argument form is what's known as modus tollens. And this argument says if A then B, but now in the second premise it says, well, B is not true. And so it concludes that A is not true either. Here's an example. If it's raining, then the streets are wet. The streets are not wet, therefore it's not raining. The A here is it's raining. The B here is the streets are wet. Yet again, anytime you see this argument form, it's going to be valid. Another common valid argument form is disjunctive syllogism. It says A or B, not B, therefore A. Here's an example. George is at school or work. Well, George is not at work, therefore George must be at school. The A is George is at school. The B is George is at work. Yet again, anytime you see this argument, it's going to be valid. Lastly, another common form is hypothetical syllogism. This argument says if A then B, and if B then C, and it concludes, therefore, if A is true, then C is true. Notice the conclusion doesn't say that A is true and it doesn't say that C is true. Rather, it just says that there's this sort of connection between them. All right, here's an example. If Monday is a holiday, then work will be canceled. If work is canceled, then the employees will be happy. Therefore, if Monday is a holiday, then the employees will be happy. The A here is Monday is a holiday. The B is work is canceled. The C is the employees will be happy. Yet again, anytime you see this argument form, it's going to be valid, no matter what you put in for the A, the B, or the C. But there's also some common argument forms that people use that are invalid. Here's just two examples. The first is known as affirming the consequent. So the first premise says, if A, then B. The second premise says, well, B is true, and it concludes A. The reason this is called affirming the consequent is because, remember, the then part of a conditional statement is called a consequent. And so the first premise gives us the conditional, and then the second premise affirms. It says that the consequent is true, and then it thereby concludes that the antecedent is true. Here's an example. If it's raining, then the streets are wet. The streets are wet, therefore it's raining. Even if those premises are true, it doesn't guarantee the conclusion. Because for all the argument tells us, even though A is one way to get to B, even though raining is one way for the streets to get wet, the fact that B is true, the fact that the streets are wet, they could have gotten wet some other way. The argument leaves that possibility open. Maybe a fire hydrant broke and got the streets wet. Maybe someone was washing their car and got the streets wet. All right. So the A here is it's raining. The B here is the streets are wet. Another common invalid form is denying the antecedent. It says if A, then B, and then takes the antecedent of the conditional and it says that's not true. It denies the antecedent, and it thereby denies the consequent as well. An example of this is if it's raining, then the streets are wet. It is not raining, therefore the streets are not wet. Yet again, this is invalid because even though A is one way to get to B, the fact that you don't have A doesn't imply that you don't have B, because there might have been other ways to get there. Even though raining could make the streets wet, and even though it's not raining, well, maybe the streets got wet some other way. In this case, the A is it's raining. The B is the streets are wet. So that's it for this video. We've discussed 4 examples of arguments that are always valid, and we have 2 examples of argument forms that are invalid. And that's not an exhaustive list. I mean, there's an infinite number of valid forms and there's an infinite number of invalid forms. But these are just some examples of some very common forms of argument that if you just look for it, you'll see people use these oftentimes. And so by recognizing them, you'll be able to quickly recognize the arguments as valid or invalid. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.